This program is a presentation of UCTV for educational and non-commercial use only.
What we propose to examine today, the Tea Party movement, is the most extraordinary expression of an American right that not only did not fade away, not only regrouped, but moved decisively further to the right, resurrecting themes that mainstream conservatism had rejected as too radical 40 years earlier, and which managed to mobilize either in action or in sympathy a Perot-sized chunk of the American electorate. At first, like many others, I was struck by the similarities between 1993 and 2008. In both years, a Democrat assumed the presidency, evoking a response from the right that, in its essence, did not regard the new president as legitimate. Both responses had their extremes, their don't tread on me sides, but both reached well up into established Republican Party politics. In one case, it culminated in the impeachment of a president, a scenario which may well repeat itself in the age of birtherism if the majority in the House changes hands the week after next. But whatever the similarities between 93 and 08, it soon became clear that there was something new, something novel about the mobilization of the past 2 years. One difference, of course, was immediately obvious, both to those who see it as significant and to those who don't. Pace Toni Morrison, but nowadays you don't hear Bill Clinton referred to anymore as our first black president. We live in a moment when the agreed upon public language dealing with race is colorblindness. If, as Michelle Alexander has shown with respect to the prison system, colorblindness has come to mask novel iterations of the racialization of American society, is this at play in the rise of the Tea Party? Or are the racist depictions of Obama more superficial than that, ephemera that take our eye away from the heart of the matter? The Tea Party phenomenon presents us with the problem of sorting out its nature as a social movement or as a political party. Does our existing understanding of social movements help us explain what's going on with the Tea Party? Is the Tea Party's destiny to be rolled into the Republican Party? Does it represent the revanchist wing in a Republican civil war, with a historical role to move the party to the right of its current conservatism? Whatever its nature as a political entity, the Tea Party has ushered us into a new model of political organization, maybe even a new model of the political party. In the past, we have known political parties that grew in affiliation with existing institutions of civil society. Christian democracy grew making use of the infrastructure of churches and parishes. Other parties grew hand in hand with the labor movement. Others grew with connections to private militias. The Tea Party has grown in affiliation with a television network. To point out Fox News' role in forming, organizing, and idea development of the Tea Party in no way invalidates the genuine passion and authenticity of the movement itself. It merely acknowledges the crucial organizational mechanism that crystallized those views into a national movement. This is not a unique phenomenon on this planet. The current ruling party in Italy was formed from the move into politics of the owner of Italy's private television networks, Silvio Berlusconi, who took much of his corporate organization with him in forming a new party, and today rules in a postmodern politics that some have labeled videocracy. is Videocracy our future? The objection may be raised that Fox News was founded as an offshoot of the Republican Party in the first place. For a number of reasons that could be adduced, this is not an unreasonable argument. But if so, in the case of the Tea Party, the directionality has shifted. The network gave rise to the party, not the other way around. After the passage of Obama's health care bill with no Republican support or input, David Frum famously lamented, "Republicans originally thought that Fox worked for us, and now we are discovering that we work for Fox." Finally, and I confess that this is a bias of mine, I hope that one thing that emerges from our work is an understanding of the Tea Party movement's subjectivity, how the world makes sense to them, the Tea Partiers themselves. Identity formation is what's at issue here. Who are we from the Tea Party's point of view? In part, Tea Party identity seems to consist of resistance to that version of the other, which is a familiar American theme and has gone by many names over the years, but is more or less what the Tea Party regards as the secular elite, the people who think they know better, who want to tell us, the Tea Partiers, or Americans generally, how to live. Nowhere has this identity been better described than in Rick Perlstein's brilliant trope, the Orthogonians, in his book, Nixonland. But with the Tea Party, this identity has merged into something older, something which goes back in American political culture, back at least to the Civil War. This is the sense, the conviction of dispossession, something that belonged to them, the Tea Party. Call it Americanism and call them, as they called themselves, the real Americans. That's being taken away. However much we may say that this thing being lost is imaginary or utterly sentimental, for Glenn Beck, it has resolved into a commercial from his childhood with a Pittsburgh football player called Mean Joe Green accepting a Coke from a kid. This subjective experience, nevertheless, seems to be quite real. How has the merger of this sense of dispossession with the anti-elitist Orthogonian point of view created something in the Tea Party we haven't seen before? And what is the likely trajectory of this consciousness? Happily, ending my remarks at this point offers me a neat segue into introducing our keynote speaker, Rick Perlstein. What Perlstein teaches us in Nixonland, and in his work generally, is that if there was a yin of the 60s, the succession of civil rights movement, Vietnam protests, counterculture, there was a yang of laying the foundations for the conservative ascendancy that has dominated American politics for decades since. In Nixonland, Perlstein looks closely at the figure of Richard Nixon, his own awareness of the resentfulness in his own personality, and his breathtaking discovery that much of America shared this perspective with him. They were all Orthogonians, and Nixon knew how to get to them. Nixonland is a meticulous retelling of the 60s, where the events are subjected to continuous reinterpretation through the Nixonian point of view, with continuing insights into how Nixon would translate these understandings into political strategy. Besides Nixonland, Rick Perlstein is the author of Before the Storm, Barry Goldwater, and the Unmaking of the American Consensus, which was the 2001 winner of the Los Angeles Times Book Award for History. It appeared on the best book lists that year of the New York Times, Washington Post, and Chicago Tribune, and also achieved status in the wake of the Clinton Wars and the 2000 Florida recount, as one of the very rare political books to receive glowing reviews in both left and right publications. From the summer of 2003 until 2005, he covered presidential campaigns as the chief national correspondent for the Village Voice. He has also published The Stock Ticker and the Super Jumbo, How the Democrats Can Again Become America's Dominant Political Party, an essay with responses from commentators including Robert Reich, Ellen Camark, and Ray Tushera, published in 2005. Perlstein received his BA from the University of Chicago in 1992, where his cultural criticism was published in the Baffler, spent 2 years in the PhD program in American culture at the University of Michigan. In 95 and 96, he worked as editor at Lingua Franca, the review of academic life. Perlstein's book reviews and essays have appeared in a wide number of publications, including in these Times, Slate, Newsday, The Nation, Dissent, The New York Observer, The Washington Post, and the San Francisco Chronicle. He has been chief national political correspondent for The Village and an online columnist for The New Republic. Perlstein has lectured at Columbia University Society of Fellows in the Humanities, Cornell University, Princeton University, the Richard Nixon Library and Birthplace, Hamilton College, Washington College, Whittier College, and we hope the University of California, Berkeley gets added to this list. One last note about Perlstein: his books are for sale out in the lobby, and after that, he will be happy to sign them for people. And finally, a high-tech note. Nixonland is available at the iTunes store in an enhanced ebook edition, which turns the book into a multimedia experience, from what I understand. Without further ado, it's my privilege and pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker, Rick Perlstein.
It's very exciting to me to be able to speak at an event that passes the torch of explication from the journalists to the scholars when it comes to the Tea Party. For reasons that I hope will become clear by the end of my remarks, the journalists have not done a very good job, I think. And this is not incidental, or if you prefer, orthogonal, to the question of how the Tea Party's evolved and should be developing in the first place, but are kind of part of the main line of causality. I'm really usually nervous when I speak to a room, like anyone. I'm, mortal, even though I have an enhanced ebook on the market. Because I'm usually worried about, nailing a case, establishing that my arguments are true, convincing people. I'm very excited to be in a place where the defining gesture is not necessarily just making an argument and convincing people, but the proliferation of questions. So with that note, I hope if I'm the keynote, I hope the keynote is the introduction of a set of questions for us all to discuss today. So I'm going to start with kind of an overture, kind of like when you go to a musical and they kind of play the musical themes that you're going to hear, South Pacific and stuff. This comes from a op-ed I published in the Washington Post in August of 2009 when the healthcare town halls were happening. It was one of the most widely read things I ever wrote. It got 1,400 comments on Washington Post before they cleared the comments. They never invited me back. Maybe it's because of what I said about journalism. But I'm just gonna start out from the middle of that essay. Before the black helicopters of the 1990s, there were right-wingers claiming access to secret documents from the 1920s, proving that the entire concept of the civil rights movement had been hatched in the Soviet Union. There was a time when the landmark 1964 Civil Rights Act was introduced and was frequently understood in the South as something that would, quote unquote, enslave whites. And back before that, there were Bolsheviks to blame. Paranoids have never lacked for subversives, and anti-Catholic subversives, anti-Catholic conspiracy theories before that. They even had their own political party in the 1840s and 50s. The instigation is always the familiar litany: expansion of the commonweal to empower new communities, accommodation to internationalism, the heightened influence of cosmopolitans, and the persecution complex of conservatives who can't stand losing an argument. My personal favorite: the federal government expanded mental health services in the Kennedy era, and one bill provided for a new facility in Alaska. One of the most widely listened to right-wing radio programs in the country, hosted by a former FBI agent, had millions of Americans believing it was built to intern political dissidents, just like in the Soviet Union. It used to be different. You never heard the late Walter Cronkite taking time in the evening news to debunk claims that a proposed mental health clinic in Alaska is actually a dumping ground for right-wing critics of the president's programs, or giving the people who made those claims time to explain themselves on the air. The media didn't adjudicate the ever-present underbrush of American paranoia as a set of conservative claims to weigh horse race style against liberal claims. Back then, a more confident media unequivocally labeled the civic outrage represented by such discourse as extremist, as out of bounds. The tree of crazy is an ever-present aspect of America's flora, only now it's being watered by misguided he said, she said reporting, and that stuff has taken over the forest. Latest word is that the enlightened and mild provisions in the draft legislation to help elderly people who want living wills, the one that hysterics turned into the death panel canard, is losing favor, according to the Wall Street Journal, quote, because of complaints over the provision. Good thing our leaders weren't so cowardly in 1964, or we would have never passed a civil rights bill because the complaints over the provision that it would enslave whites. So that's what I wrote in August of 2009. Some things have changed, some things haven't. Really what I'm writing about is continuity and change. It's the classic historian's question. So I think having you all assembled before me, I'd like to encourage everyone who wants to understand the Tea Party, and every scholar of the Tea Party especially, to read more history, lots and lots of history. No matter your discipline, I'd encourage people to read as much as possible. Books like Alan Brinkley's Voices of Protest, Huey Long, Father Coughlin, and the Great Depression, David Ashinsky's A Conspiracy So Immense, The World of Joseph McCarthy. If you're going to read my own books to understand the Tea Party, my first one is better, because I talk a lot more about right-wing populism, kind of when and the conservative movement. When Nixon takes over, he kind of sucks the oxygen out of the room from the conservative movement. People should be reading Chip Berlay's books. One interesting thing about the Before the Storm, back then I thought it would be kind of a cool thing if a graduate student would do like a really good dissertation on the John Birch Society, or maybe a biography of Robert Welch, the president of the John Birch Society, the founder of the John Birch Society. But back then, in 2001, it seemed a little frou-frou. It seemed a little effervescent. It seemed a little narrow, right? And I must say that it never occurred to me then just how central a lot of John Birch Society discourse would be in the center of the political firmament. So I kind of wish I'd paid a little closer attention to those early 60s far-right pamphlets that I found in places like the Hoover Institute and the LBJ Library, where all the kind of canards that we hear about Barack Obama were being made against LBJ, who, by the way, was at a, as you may know from the 1964 version of Photoshop, had gone to a cannibal ceremony in Africa. But others, Randy Shilts, the mayor of Castro Street, does a great job of conveying the "we want our country back" poetics of the Anita Bryant and Briggs Initiative movements in the late 70s, and the sense of white working class dispossession that informed Dan White. One more I'll mention is a kind of idiosyncratic instant classic, Bethany Morton's Between God and the Market, Walmart and the Rise of Christian Capitalism. And what's truly valuable about that work is it really gets at the bottom-up nature of a lot of this social change. Walmart followed the housewives that it hired in creating a Christian capitalism, not the other way around. It's remarkable how far back you can go and find relevant texts. What Larry says about everyone declaring the death knell of the right, it's shockingly prevalent and shockingly disturbing. And until the political culture has a grasp of how deeply ingrained right-wing populism is in the national DNA, from the founding, from the debates between slave states and free states at the Constitutional Convention, from the anti-federalism of Shays' Rebellion, from the lost cause ideology of the Civil War and post-Civil War, which in fact informs not only so much of Southern culture, but has kind of infiltrated the interstices of American political culture itself, the Southernization of America and the Americanization of the South, as one book title had it. Jeet Heer is a scholar in Canada who has a book coming out on Little Orphan Annie, which in 1930 was kind of the key vector for this kind of anti-elite right-wing populism. He dug up a fascinating Little Orphan Annie cartoon of all these effete artists and pointy-headed bureaucrats who couldn't park their bicycle straight, and professors sipping latte at some fancy party, and defying the common wisdom of the folk that laissez-faire economics is the royal road to prosperity and justice. We have Colonel McCormick, the publisher of the Chicago Tribune, in 1941, in September of 1941, just 3 months before Pearl Harbor, saying that FDR aimed to create, quote, a centralized despotic government different in no essential detail from Hitler's despotism. Hitler is a very powerful red thread in the discourse of right-wing extremist movements and grassroots right-wing expression. I might also mention in this context a very important part of my book, Nixonland, where I went through the letters to Senator Paul Douglas in 1966, when Martin Luther King was marching for open housing in Chicago, and Lyndon Johnson was pushing an open housing bill that was going to be really the first civil rights bill to equally impact the North and the South. Here's one quote. It is my firm belief, and that of all my neighbors, that King should be taken into custody. Today, the insufferable arrogance of this character places him on a pedestal as a dark-skinned Hitler. We live in the era of the Santa Clausification of Martin Luther King, so it's important to remember that he was a figure of terror to people, including Ronald Reagan, who said that, of course, he was shot, that he helped bring it on himself the first time he said that people should be able to choose the laws that they're going to follow. But then there's the other side, like in The Simpsons, the Arnold Schwarzenegger guy who says he's fighting commie-fascist Nazis, right? Another letter to Paul Douglas, is the ultimate aim the same as the Soviet Union, when all property was collectivized? And by the way, the law, something like that passed 2 years later in 1968, and indeed all property was collectivized. I could go on, and let me just focus quickly on an expression early in 1962, I should say. Larry mentioned, and it's a very important thing to keep in mind, that these expressions almost always, or always accompany the ascendancy of liberals to national power. When John F. Kennedy came along, that's when the John Birch Society came into view. There was even, in a lot of ways, a bigger and more robust movement, although it didn't last, that bears uncanny resemblance to the Tea Parties, in that it was a mass movement involving rallies at cities around the country that often attracted more people than some of the Tea Party rallies do now in places like Miami and Odessa, Texas. It was called the National Indignation Convention. No one knows about this, but if you look back in the New York Times and look at the coverage of the National Indignation Convention, two things stand out to me. One is how sparse the coverage was. which is in profound contradistinction to the privileging of the Tea Party as the stuff that everyone should be paying attention to all the time. We're talking about 3, 4, 5 paragraph items, deep in the paper. But beyond that, the tropes with which the activists express themselves are things that we should be attending to very closely. They say that they're neither Democrat nor Republican. They say they have no leaders. Often they say it's the first time we've ever been involved in politics, which I think is a very important constituent element of these kind of rage-driven reaction movements, and have a very important consequence for their political development. You get a situation like, since a lot of right-wing reaction movements are, in a certain sense, fundamentally anti-political, they're about purification, it's always fascinating to see when a group that invests political energy for the first time comes up across the realities of governance and disillusionment. And that's one of the reasons I think that these kind of expressions tend to come in waves to be exploited by what tends to be a permanent conservative infrastructure in DC. I'll talk more about that. But let me actually quote something from Time magazine to get at that. I can't resist a funny story. The Wrath of the Rightists, this is an article about the National Indignation Convention. It was called The Ultras. It's very interesting to compare, by the way, to Time magazine's cover story on Glenn Beck, which was all about how many books Glenn Beck sells, how charismatic he is, what an interesting guy he is. He was kind of the it girl of 2009 on the cover of Time magazine. The wrath of the rightists is sometimes turned toward their idols at the first hint of clay feet. When Frank McGee's National Indignation Convention meeting in Dallas was unable to raise a pair of conservative Republicans on the telephone for a scheduled speaking appearance, that was the 1962 version of Skype, McGee angrily took to the stage and shouted, "They have signed their death notes as politicians in the U.S." Whoa. Several minutes later, Bruce Alger, one of the politicians, came to the phone and all was forgiven. A McGee aide had simply dialed the wrong number. Very funny, but also indicative of kind of how this anti-politics works. The feet of clay are always there to be revealed. Just one more example. If we're here in California, Max Rafferty, who was elected the superintendent of education in California, a nationwide office. He was elected against the kind of a very much a kind of mainstream administrative liberal Tom Braden, who ended up kind of being a kind of the Alan Keyes on one of the Sunday shows. But he was elected calling progressive education an incubator for, quote, unwashed, leather-jacketed slobs whose favorite sport is ravaging little girls. Once in office, he crusaded against the Dictionary of American Slang, which he called a practicing handbook of sexual perversion. In 1966, his crusade was against John Hope Franklin's history textbook, Land of the Free. This has our resonances, of course, to the Texas business, which I've seen back to the mid-50s in Texas, this kind of politics, often about favoring the UN. Because of its frank discussions of the problems of minorities would give children, quote, a guilt complex. He also crusaded against a little college in Berkeley, for providing a 4-year course in sex, drugs, and treason. So, continuities. What are I've come up with some intellectual concepts, kind of in my mind, privately. I've never really sort of written about them because I'm not an academic or a scholar, and I don't tend not to write methodological or programmatic essays, but kind of some concepts that I've come across to help me explain some of this stuff. The one is the notion that I call the chain of equivalencies. Conservatives of all sorts draw existential sustenance from holding up such chains of equivalencies as unbroken and unbreakable, from the secularity of liberal elites. And if you look at the voting guide in Nevada, the Mormon Harry Reid gets a 0 for faith-friendly. And Newt Gingrich has said that Nancy Pelosi and Harry Reid and Barack Obama are leading a secular socialist takeover of America. So the secularity of liberal elites, their socialist devotion to expanding coercive tax-grubbing power of the state, imminent totalitarian gun grabbing and defilement of the honor of our armed forces, all yoked to Americanness as a certain self-evident set of sociological and cultural qualities, two versions of patriotism. Historians will be familiar with Gary Gerstl's civic nationalism and racial nationalism. The racial part is kind of hard to map for reasons I'm sure will be discussed, but one is a set of traits. The other is a commitment to a set of ideas and procedures. Evangelicals call it a worldview, this idea of a chain of equivalencies. When you break one link of the chain, you open the Pandora's box, to mix the metaphor. It's a gestalt thinking, and it's certainly evident at Tea Party rallies, as it was across the history I'm relating. Adlai Stevenson, speaking at the 1963 United Nations Day observance in Dallas was shouted down, and when he walked out, a grimacing, wild-eyed lady thwacked him on the head with a picket sign. Stevenson was baffled. He was baffled by the audience response and by this woman. And by the way, despite the continuities of these expressions, liberals always manage to be baffled when they raise their head. What's the matter, madam? What can I do for you? Her response came with self-righteous fury. Well, if you don't know, I can't help you. It's obvious, right? It's a gestalt. It's obvious that Barack Obama is not, in fact, a centrist, but an extremist, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Another concept, besides the chain of equivalencies, is what I call sluicing, where the transcendent evil, be it, I don't know, a Catholic conspiracy in some period, or communism in the 1960s, or Islamofascism now, becomes the framework through which all grievances and all anxieties are kind of washed through. And I just can think of, I could just proliferate examples all day. When the Dodger Stadium was being built in Chavez Ravine in 1961-ish, and during the high tide of this kind of Birchite mentality, the idea of eminent domain and things like urban renewal were traced to kind of Soviet proof texts. Things like the city manager form of government, also from the same period, was discussed in the same way. And we'll move on to, I think the resonances with our own time, which I think are sort of formulating in your mind as I speak. But we need better accounts of what has been shared across this bridge of time. We need a poetics. That's what scholars can do. They can come up with a sense of shared tropes, symbology, or rhetoric. We need genealogies. Where do certain ideas come from? How deep do they reach? We need iconographies. What are the symbols? We need an epistemologies. Or possibly just what actually I wrote here is just an epistemology. Because what you might call the right-wing populist logic of truth works in strikingly continuous ways across this bridge of years, rooted, as Jill Lepore has recently noted in her neat little new book, The Whites of Their Eyes, in a intellectual tradition that shares a lot with religious fundamentalism. The idea of the text is revealed as complete unto itself, and all kinds of intellectual gymnastics involving the apologetics and the selective reading of religious texts can be mapped against the reading of the Constitution by a lot of the Tea Party folks. She does a great job of it, so we don't need that as much, but we need those other things. But here's an example of how the epistemology works. The Sharia law scare. The idea that there exists an organized force to actually literally to turn the whatever 2% of the population who are Muslim into the masters of the American law. The proof text for that has been a real text. That's how the epistemology works. It's a 1991 strategy paper from the Muslim Brotherhood that says that followers, quote, must understand their work in America as a kind of grand jihad in eliminating and destroying the Western civilization from within. Very resonant to, the kind of, the American Communist Party really did say, in 1928, here's a map of what the black nation that we can separate from the rest of the United States can look like. So that proves that this is in fact their active intention and has to be fought at every turn. There's a resonance to the 1970s invocation of the fear of secular humanism as a unified ideology that was the product of a conspiracy to literally, re-educate the youth of America. That comes from a very fascinating proof text, too, that needs to be understood according to a certain kind of epistemology. They always cited the 1961 Supreme Court case, Tarkasco versus Watkins. Anyone from Bolt know what that one was? It was the court voted 9-0 that religious expressions that are not strictly speaking theistic are owed First Amendment protection. And Justice Black said, among the religions in this country which do not teach what will be generally considered a belief in the existence of God are Buddhism, Taoism, ethical culture, secular humanism, and others. He cited a case from 1967 protecting the worship rights of a group that called their religious expression humanism. Secular humanism, capital S, capital H, the bugaboo of 1,000 grubby 70s far-right and not-so-far-right pamphlets, was reified as a religion, basically because of this sort of fanciful slip of the pen by Justice Black. And not merely a religion, but one that was self-evidently being taught in public schools, therefore defying the Constitution. Thus the syllogism, either it should stop getting taught, or other religions should allow it to be taught. This Washington-based conservative movement has turned moralistic piety to serve the larger pro-business conservative cause in ways unimaginable to the U.S. Chamber of Commerce in, say, 1928. In 1974, for example, fundamentalist preachers and housewives in Kanawha County, West Virginia, and if you want more reference for this, there's an outstanding documentary on NPR about Kanawha County, the textbook wars, crusaded against allegedly ungodly textbooks assigned by the local school board. It escalated into dynamite. Such localized crusades against cosmopolitan government interference in the intimate realm of family life, whether forcing gay school teachers on children, gay rights ordinances, and places like Miami, all different questions about striking religion from the public square became completely routine in the 1970s. But also routine in the 1970s, organizers from the Heritage Foundation in Washington, formed in 1974, for example, descended on West Virginia to link up the local activists with similar uprisings nationwide. In a feedback loop, conservative entrepreneurs fundraised nationally via direct mail by dramatizing the DC intensified local outrages that had been intensified and unified and turned into a kind of a sluiced, shall we say, by the DC infrastructure. The money raised by the likes of Richard Viguerie, the direct mail pioneer who long described himself as a anti-big business conservative, was largely funneled into the same anti-government agenda championed since the rise of the administrative state over a century ago. Let me just give some examples of how this kind of works in the Tea Party era. So one of the guys arrested in Senator Mary Landrieu's office, you recall that case this year, where they were trying to claim that she was systematically ignoring the deluge of calls not to vote for health care, and they tried to catch this on film and ended up trespassing and illegally recording in her office. One of the guys arrested had been a conservative student at the University of Minnesota Morris, who was approached to work on the school paper by the editor because they wanted a conservative columnist. Soon after, the Leadership Institute, which is a group that goes back to the 1960s and was founded by a guy named Morton Blackwell, who is one of these guys who just shows up in every generation as basically a professional sluicer, if you will, and was the youngest delegate, Barry Goldwater delegate at the 1964 National Convention, and San Francisco, the Leadership Institute offered him a grant to start a conservative newspaper at his tiny little state school. Before long, the same guy was flying to Arizona State to lead seminars in right-wing political street theater associated with the protest warrior, quote-unquote, movement. Then he hooked up with Andrew Breitbart, of course, and became a Tea Party activist. There are tons of stories like this. And the Tea Party will provide an excellent case study about how institutions like this rejuvenate and rebrand themselves, sluicing themselves against whatever grassroots expressive rage they can exploit. When I reported here from California in 2003 on the recall, it became very obvious to me that the two elements of kind of grassroots rage that were being sluiced and exploited were A, the car tax that Gray Davis increased, which everyone mentioned, and the notion that undocumented immigrants were going to get driver's licenses. You know, the sound piece of public policy which actually keeps, you know, immigrants from not driving, you know, 20 miles an hour on the freeway, you know, which was, you know, John and Ken down at the talk radio in Los Angeles were going absolutely berserk about this. Not to reduce things to puppet masters and puppets, but we need to come up with something more nuanced, a working knowledge, at least as sophisticated as its organizers itself, about how this organic reactionary rage and sophisticated top-down organizing work together. Here was the conclusion to my article about the recall. It was called Orange County Anguish, and it was in the Voice in 2003. Phil Pauley is the director of Rescue California Recall Gray Davis, a group whose 12th-story headquarters in Sacramento's beautiful old Elks building is so spare, it resembles an office still transacting business the day after the movers have carted everything away. Such is the face of mass content of grassroots politics in California. When I noticed Pauley spinning a coin between his fingers like it's a chip, I asked him if he's a poker player. He confirms he is, and then he says that all elections are poker games. He tells the story of the jackpot he and his fellow Republicans are about to rake in with an elegance that cannot be improved upon, just 17 words. We found an opponent with a really weak hand. We just kept raising and raising the stakes. There are these professionals who are always looking for these opportunities. One of them was another guy I interviewed when I was down here in 2003. His name is Sal Russo. He's the head of one of the big Tea Party umbrella groups. He basically told me that he uses a certain talk radio station in Sacramento as his precinct captain. So we're talking about the idea of a videocracy and, you know, who's gaming who and all that. His office is a little different. It's sumptuous. Pictures of Reagan everywhere, leather, you know, wood panels. So, you know, that's the St. Regis bar version of this. I mentioned the question of rebranding. Madman fans know what happened when a dog food company got involved in the scandal. You know, Don Draper said, you know, we have to change the name of the dog food. There's a lot going on with that. I'm not going to go through the demographics of and poll results, but they basically show that, you know, the constituency of the Tea Party movement is the constituency of the Republican Party. And let me quote one of the, you know, sort of really fun journalists who's been doing a good job with this stuff. Matt Taibbi of the Rolling Stone. The individuals in the Tea Party may come from different walks of life, but most of them have a few things in common. After nearly a year of talking with Tea Party members from Nevada to New Jersey, I can count on one hand the key elements I expected to hear in nearly every interview. One, every single one of them was that exceptional Republican who did protest spending in the Bush years, and that one of them is the hypocrite who only took to the streets when a black Democratic president launched an emergency stimulus one. Not me, I was protesting, is a common explanation. Rebranding. I'm going to skip a few things because let me actually just make a shout out to the political scientists real quickly. There's a great distinguished late professor at this university, Michael Paul Rogan, who would have really, we need him. He was better at grasping the subjectivity of the political unconscious of these kinds of questions better than anyone. But before he did that, in 1967, he wrote a book called The Intellectuals and McCarthy, the Radical Specter. And what he did in that book was using the tools of regression analysis to try to demonstrate that the people who voted for McCarthy were not, pace what Richard Hofstadter said, the same people who had voted for the populists in the 1890s. Now, I don't know how that stands the test of time. I don't know methodologically whether he was on the money or not, but there's going to be a heck of a lot of data in 3 weeks. And, dependent and independent variables, who voted for the Tea Party candidates, who also voted for, all sorts of things. I'll just leave that to the experts to chew on. But I need to get to 2 points. I don't have much time. I want to leave time for at least a couple questions. And these are the most important discontinuities, the most important changes, the most important differences. Well, there's the simple institutional and political maturation of the conservative movement. I've mentioned that. But there are two things that are a little less obvious and a little less organic. And I referred to one of them at the beginning of my remarks, and that's media. And I'm not just talking about the rise of Fox News. And I'm not even just talking about the rise of meretricious 24-hour news where they have to fill hour after hour after hour with the next shiny object or the next person shouting an opinion. Much more important than that, I think, is the evolution of journalism that I would describe in the word Agnewism. I won't dwell too much. You can read all about it in Nixon Land or just about any book about Nixon. But the process by which journalistic judgment was denuded by the anxiety media operations developed about appearing liberal and not appearing to understand the heartland, where all reactionary expressions are true and organic and cannot be contested by the media. That's the name of the game, and I think in organic and integrated ways, it's unimaginable to understand the playing field of this election, the Tea Parties, without going back to the things that Spiro Agnew and Richard Nixon did in 1969 and 1970 and 1991. Let me just give one example. And this is kind of really the only kind of original kind of argument I'm going to be offering here, and I've never written about it. It kind of was buried away in my notes, and I didn't realize its relevance. But basically, one of the biggest changes attendant to the media devolution I'm talking about, there have always been discourses about extremists of the left and right as the problem. Instances of false equivalence are now not new, and underlying them, the punditocratic notion that a class of wise men in Washington both best understand the soul of the American people and what they need and can say what's best for them and speak for them. But it was also always accompanied by a basic bedrock understanding coming out of the experience of the World War II generation, one that I think is, in a sense, fundamentally correct and is a piece of wisdom that has been profoundly lost. And that's the idea that right-wing extremism is different. Characteristics include a demonic energy all too easily awakened by ambitious demagogues that can easily escalate into chaos, violence, and finally, an emergent anti-democratic authoritarianism. You see this kind of wisdom expressed in texts like 12 Angry Men, or 7 Days in May, or A Face in the Crowd, or All the King's Men. The idea that there's these demonic reactionary energies in the people that are just waiting to come loose. And you can kind of see how the experience of fascism informed this. You see it practically in politics. For example, when you listen to the Lyndon Johnson tapes, and he's talking about whether he should fish or cut bait in Vietnam, and he talks about how they'd impeach a president who runs out. And this idea of the experience he had when the Democrats lost China, and he lost some of his best friends in the Senate. This idea that the right is just kind of waiting to rise up against a quisling. But more importantly, those characteristics were understood to be operative and true, and even especially true when the left was most extreme. It's kind of paradoxical. When the left was most violent, chaotic, even authoritarian. Think of, People's Park and Sinkyu and the Symbionese Liberation Army, and that even the most robust outbreaks of left-wing extremism were child's play compared to what would happen if right-wing extremism was unleashed. This was just a basic understanding. The idea that the main thing to fear from outbreaks of left-wing extremism was, in fact, the reaction of the right that would be unleashed. This is serious stuff. Early in 1969, Henry Kissinger had a meeting with George McGovern. He writes about this in the book Oliver Stone's USA. McGovern has a chapter. He says, Kissinger readily conceded that the war was a terrible mistake, but he said, were the president to pull out now, the American right wing would go out of control across the country. The president would lose his most committed constituency. We couldn't govern the country, he said. Another example, of course, and Henry Kissinger was a refugee from Nazism. He told journalists on occasion that the United States must leave Vietnam without suffering a defeat in order to avert a dangerous right-wing backlash such as occurred after the fall of China in 1949. Here's Henry Kissinger. I won't do the accent. It's been our conviction that if political decisions were to be made in the streets, the victors would not be the upper middle-class college kids, but some real tough guys. The society which makes its decisions in this matter will sooner or later be driven to some form of Caesarism, in which the most brutal force in society takes over. Therefore, we believe that what really was at stake here was not this president. What was at stake here was the problem of authority in this society altogether. The same kind of discourse accompanied the race riots, even among the most respectable conservatives. The idea that, in fact, they had to be repressive against this stuff, or else the real repressive people would come around. Here's a quote from Richard Nixon writing in U.S. News and World Report in 1966 about that summer's race riots. From mob rule, it is but a single step to lynch law and the deterioration of the rights of the minority. David Lawrence, who was the very conservative editor of U.S. News, but also a very establishment guy, said the slogan Black Power is widely proclaimed, but it can only stir up more race consciousness and a cry for retaliation by white power. Agnew said, right now we must decide whether we will take the trouble to stave off the totalitarian state. Will we stop the wildness now before it's too late, before the witch hunting and repression that are all too inevitable begin? Of course, the bad faith thereby revealed in Watergate there. Don't need to comment upon. But Houston, Tom Charles Houston and the Houston Plan basically said the same thing. We have to use extraordinary means to defeat the left-wing extremists, to fight real repression that somehow would come elsewhere from the White House. If people are interested, I could tell you more. Margaret Chase Smith gave a second Declaration of Conscience in 1970. Lauren Green, who supported Hubert Humphrey for president in 1972, feared the awesome possibility of an overreaction from the right in response to the disruptions from the left, with the acquiescence of the man in the street. Once that's gone, you get a completely different media ecology. And you get a sense in which, a political magazine can say there's a lot of craziness in this election, and then manage to come up with 4 Democratic and 4 Republican examples. So what would take more than 2 minutes would be a certain, so I'll just leave it as a question. The most profound question, in a sense, and one that keeps me up awake and awake at night, and that I feel like I've really come no closer to getting the answer to than when I began this work 14 years ago. Why is America like this? Why is the American white middle class so susceptible to rage, so susceptible to a message that they are somehow being profoundly dispossessed, so susceptible to a poetics of scapegoating and cultural demagoguery? My answers these days have a lot to do with, and this is where a thinker like Paul Rogan would have been great, a certain kind of psychoanalytic trauma that comes from not being dependent on government, but being dependent on government in a country where government is not, being dependent on government is shameful and not valued. A learned helplessness that comes from not being helped, not being taken care of. And I guess I'll conclude, and I'm not sure if I've given enough context for it to make sense, but Jefferson Cowie, another great book, Staying Alive, that came out this year, talks about the characteristic note of country music as a paradoxical combination of rebellion and patriotic nationalism. The state is his enemy, the nation his mystical identity. So if I can do a recitation, and I won't sing, the song God Bless the USA, which I think has had just an extraordinary life, a country song by Lee Greenwood that I'm sure everyone would know the words to at any Tea Party anywhere in America. If tomorrow all the things are gone I worked for all my life, and I had to start again with just my children and my wife, I thank my lucky stars that I'm living here today because the flag still stands for freedom and they can't take that away. I'm proud to be an American, or at least I know I'm free, and I proudly stand up next to you and declare it still today. There ain't no doubt I love this land. God bless the USA. The storyline basically is, yes, in America, you, interpolated as the white male patriarch, can be dispossessed of your livelihood at any time. And that's fate. That's just it. There's nothing you can do about it. But at least, like W.E.B. Du Bois talked about the psychic wage of whiteness that white Southerners had, that at least they weren't black. There's this psychic wage of patriotism, that this is still the best possible country no matter what, because one can remain free even after one's boss fires you without cause, fires you for starting a union, and takes away all the things that you've worked for all your life. That there's nothing in the mystically true America that can hold you back from deliverance, but America's pollution by its internal enemies. And that sounds like a Tea Partier to me.